Analogy is relating a new case to an original case by a commonality giving them the same judgment. This chapter has one of the most important lessons in logic. It is of three types: analogy for having the same reason, analogy by indication, and analogy by comparison. 1. Analogy for having the same reason. Qiyas illah. What that means is this: a thing has a judgment for a reason. Very simple. For example, it's haram to say uff to your parents. Saying uff to your parents has a judgment, which is haram, for a reason, which is that it harms them. A thing has a judgment for a reason. A thing such as saying uff to the parents has a judgment, which is haram, for a reason. It hurts them. So if another thing has the same reason, then it should have the same judgment. It's logical. Like what? Is there a branch for this original case? Yes. Hitting the parents, beating the parents. Is it haram to strike your parents? Yes, it is haram. What's your proof? The proof is that it's haram to say uff to your parents. So someone might say, well, saying uff is one thing and hitting them is another thing. That's apples and oranges, buddy. Apples and oranges. If you want, you might say apples and oranges are both fruits. Let me tell you. Saying uff to the parents is haram because it harms them. So, does striking the parents harm them? Yes. Then it should also be haram because it has the same reason. The reason that we had the judgment for the first one is existing in the second one. So why would this one be haram and this one wouldn't be haram? That's qiyasu illah. Analogy for having the same reason. I personally don't like when people say apples and oranges because they're both fruits. So, I mean, maybe you should say something like apples and rocks. But maybe that's just me. I don't know. I don't say it myself. I mean, I get the point, so maybe it's just me. Now, what's interesting about this section here, this particular one, is we're not talking about an intellectual necessity. We're not talking about an intellectual necessity. This analogy that we just did is not an intellectual necessity. What's the intellectual necessity? The intellectual necessity is that the mind says it must be like this. Only it has to be, otherwise is impossible. That's intellectual necessity. Intellectual necessity is to say anything other than this is impossible. Intellectually impossible. Let me give you something that makes it closer to the understanding. If it were said, had it been said that whatever is alive is pure and whatever is dead is filthy, then if something is alive, so that's a reason, then its judgment should be there, which is that it's pure. And if something is dead, then that's a reason. Then its judgment is that it is filthy. But didn't we learn that all of the living things are pure except the dog and the pig? Yes, they're alive like we're alive, but they're filthy and we're not. And didn't we learn that all the dead things are filthy except the human and the fish and the locust? Yes. So just because two things have the same reason, it's not a mental necessity that they have the same judgment. Now, is it impossible that Allah would make it? Is it intellectually impossible that Allah would make it haram to say uff to the parents? But it's not haram to beat them. That's not intellectual necessity. It's not intellectual necessity. It's less than an intellectual necessity. It's a sound conclusion, but it's not an intellectual necessity. In other words, there are many cases in the religion, many times in the religion, when two things have the same reason, but they don't have the same judgment. That's why we're not allowed to make qiyas. We're not qualified for that. We don't have enough knowledge. You need a lot of knowledge to be able to do that, to say halal and haram. Analogy by indication is for the original case to have an indication of the judgment of new case without necessitating it. In other words, the second type, analogy by indication, is basically a case where if you look at something in one way, then they should have the same judgment. But if you look at it from another way, then they wouldn't have the same judgment. So it's not as strong as the first one. What's an example of that? An example of that is the case of the money of the child. Is it subject to zakah or not? If you look at it from the perspective of being money, then yes. But if you look at it from the perspective of it being of the childhood, that it's owned by a child, then no. So then which one, how should it be compared? Shafi'i said, yes, it's money, so there's zakah on it. Abu Hanifa said, no, that's a child, so there's no zakah on it. And 3 is analogy by comparison. It consists of a derivative case being compared to 2 original cases, and then is given the ruling of the one it most resembles. What this amounts to is comparing one thing to 2 things, seeing which one does it resemble the most. It's not like the previous one. The previous one is you just have one thing, but it depends on how you look at it. You look at it from this way or you look at it from this way. The third one is you have one thing compared to 2 things. Which one is it most like? So it's when a case that needs an answer has ties to 2 origins. And then it will be put in accordance with whichever one it is most similar. It will be made to comply with whichever one it's most similar. For instance, concerning blood money, a killed slave is similar to a freeman by being human. Slave is a human, the freeman is a human. But also it's similar to an animal by being an owned asset, because the slave is owned and the animal is owned. See how you have to be qualified to make qiyas, because you have to even know what to compare. So which one is he most like the slave? Is he most like a freeman or most like an animal? He is closer in resemblance to an asset than to a freeman. Why? Because he can be sold, inherited, can be dedicated as an endowment. The price of his damaged parts that decrease his value must be guaranteed. His value must be guaranteed even if it exceeds the value of blood money of a freeman, of a freeman's blood money. So this third type of qiyas is the weakest of the 3, and some scholars denied it. But subhanallah, I hope that you can appreciate that. Those 3, understand them very well. MashaAllah. MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Qiyas has integrals, right? Like, what are the integrals of the qiyas? You have a new case, that's actually an integral, and an old case, that's an integral. And you have to have a reason, that's an integral for the qiyas. And you have to have a judgment. So 4 integrals. A new case, an old case, a reason, and a judgment. One of the conditions of the derivative case is that it be compatible with the original case concerning the reason that gives them the same judgment. Yani, the comparison has to be valid, in simple terms. One of the conditions for the qiyas to be valid is that what this mujtahid is using is evidence according to him in the first place. It has to be evidence in the first place for him. So he can't make qiyas off of something that's not even proof. Like a Shafi'i scholar would not use the customs of the people of Al-Madinah as evidence. He doesn't use the customs of the people of Medina as evidence. So how could a Shafi'i then turn around and base an analogy off of something that's not even evidence according to him? So then, if you want to test your qiyas, is your qiyas a valid one or not, then argue that qiyas, argue that analogy, that comparison with someone who agrees with your proof. So you say to someone, hey, listen, this is the conclusion I came to. I say based on this, the answer is this. And you want to see, do you find that to be, is it valid? Are you really on point? So that person who's now going to investigate your claim, he has to also agree that what you're using is proof. So if he agrees and he says, okay, that thing that you're starting from, we agree that's proof, but the answer you got to, no, that's not right. That's not a right comparison because of this and this. So the answer should be this. So then it's not a valid qiyas, or it is a valid qiyas. He says, yes, here, this proof of yours, I agree, and the answer you got to, I agree. But if in the first place you said to him, hey, look, here, I use this as proof to get to this answer, what do you say? If in the first place he says, that's not even proof, buddy. What are you talking about? Your whole answer is nothing. Whatever you got to, I don't even agree from how you started. It's a condition for the old case that you want to use to give the judgment to the new case, that the old case, that its evidence is accepted in the first place. And one of the conditions to be a true reason for the judgment is that the judgment be consistently present when the reason exists, so that neither its description nor its concept can be refuted. A condition for the illah, the reason, is that if the reason exists, the judgment exists. So if the reason exists and the judgment does not exist, then that's not really the reason. How do you test it? Refute it. If you can refute it, you'll find that it's not really the reason. How do you refute it? Refute the statement. If someone says the reason for this is this, and this, and this. So take that statement. If you can refute it, then you've shown that that's not the proper reason. Or if someone describes something, then take that description. If you can refute it, then you know that's not the proper reason. Let's see how. I'll give you a very easy one, inshallah. What if someone said, the reason for the iddah is to make sure that the woman is not pregnant? So can you refute that? You can say, well, you can know that the woman is not pregnant by a menstrual cycle, and the iddah goes beyond a menstrual cycle. So she will know that she's not pregnant, and she'll still be in her iddah. So that can't be the reason. Or like if someone said, zakah is due on animals because it fulfills the needs of the poor. Zakah is due on animals because it fulfills the needs of the poor. Can you refute that? Well, you could say diamonds and rubies and precious stones, they also fulfill the needs of the poor, but there's no zakah on them. So then that's not really the reason. That's not the true reason, because the reason exists in the other one, but the judgment doesn't exist. So then it's not really the reason. So one of the conditions to be a true reason for the judgment is that the judgment be consistently present when that reason exists, so that neither its description nor its concept can be refuted. One of the conditions of the judgment is that it follow the reason in absence and presence. Yani, the judgment, if the reason is there, the judgment is there. If the reason is missing, the judgment is missing. Like what? Like the prohibition of drinking a drink. The prohibition of drinking a drink. What's the reason for not being allowed to drink a drink? It's intoxicating power. It's power to intoxicate or potential to intoxicate. Because if a person has a tolerance, for example, he's not excused. So its potential to intoxicate is what makes it haram. That's the reason. So when that reason exists, then the judgment exists. It's haram to drink that. When that reason is missing, the judgment is missing. It's not haram to drink that. Wallahu tabaraka wa ta'ala a'lam. Allah knows best. You have any question I can answer for you?